Hey, my name is Melody, and I was born on 21st of December 1994, the same year as the smartphone came on the market. As I grew up, I saw the rise of the media devices we now use on a daily basis without even thinking about it. I love media and technology. It keeps me staying in touch with my friends all over the world. It gives me access to all the information I want to know. And let's be honest, without Google Maps, I would get lost all the time. But there is a downside. Almost weekly there are newspapers and research reports about negative influences of media on children and young adults. But what is it really like growing up with media?
I think one of the things that has happened to the first generation of kids to grow up always being online, which by the way are my kids. They have never experienced dial-up or anything like that. They've always had always on. And what I've seen is they have a global awareness that was not present in my generation. They really feel as if this is one world. They also feel as if they are always connected to everyone else. There is a feeling of being connected that I did not have in my generation. And I think the third thing is that there is a sense of movement forward, the sense of going somewhere, of maybe you might call it progress, that I think was not present in previous generations.
I think this generation has a sense that information wants to be free and information about themselves wants to be free. And in a way, there's a kind of self-surveillance that I think that young people don't think about in political terms. But it is a political issue. People put their lives on the screen. They put really intimate details of their lives out there. And with very little thought that there might be people using that information in ways that are not benign. I did an interview with a 16-year-old that is precious to me because he talked about how he knows that people, can read his email. He knows that people somehow he senses that his texts are being saved in some server in the sky. But he, when he wants to have a private conversation, he goes to payphones, and he feels that payphones are the only safe place for him to talk. I mean, you have this sense of even young people looking for the interstices of the system to find a little privacy. I don't think this is good. I think that, my grandmother, who came from a European background, taught me how to be a citizen at mailboxes in New York City, where she brought me down to the mailboxes. She said, unlike in Europe, where, bad governments would read your mail and open your mail, in America, it's a federal offense. She's saying it's a federal offense to read somebody else's mail. And that's what makes this country great. That kind of privacy is what gives you rights as a citizen. So in a way, I learned to be a civil libertarian. I learned to be an American at these mailboxes as a kid. I don't know where to take my daughter to teach her that. When we go through the Mass Pike and there's Easy Pass, my car is tracked, there's surveillance cameras all over. We're both giving up unprecedented amounts of information in profiling. I think that it's hard to teach the relationship between privacy and democracy, and it's also hard to teach the relationship between intimacy and privacy. What is intimacy without privacy? I think this is really a question for this generation.
Most people are unaware of how exposed they've made themselves. You talk to young people, for example, who've got their own personal blog sites or their presence on YouTube or Facebook, and that they may come to regret doing some of the things they did on video on the internet, or saying the things that they did, especially when they start applying for jobs and employers begin to look back through the digital record of these people, the trace that they've left in the public domain. But quite unaware, every single day that we do something digital, we are potentially leaving a trace out there, and that if somebody wanted to find out where we were shopping, what we were doing, who we were communicating with, why we were doing it, what websites we were logging onto, they could do it. it's a very, very exposed set of media, these electronic communication devices that we now use. And the point is that they're fantastically convenient. And none of us would willingly give them up. But what we would want, if we really thought carefully about what it meant whenever we use these devices, we would want much, much greater individual security for our communication.
So, regardless of whether you think, social technology and the internet is good or bad, it is. This is what, the genie is out of the bottle. And I think that's an amazing thing. The social web can do more good in the world than it can do bad. And it's the choice of people and the people who are using it as to what they want to do with it. It is the most empowering generational shift that has ever happened.
I do think they think differently, and the real question, I think, is how much of that is normal human plasticity, right? We all are really good at responding to opportunities, and this young generation has different opportunities than my generation had. And how much of it is actually that their brains are being wired differently because of exposure to the media environment they're being exposed to. The first category is it's relatively easy to see examples of that. In the States right now, because we're very good at moral panics, people my age, mid-40s and up, are wringing their hands right over what teens are doing on Facebook. As if we would not have done those things had Facebook existed when we were young. And so we want to project this idea, I wasn't putting drunk pictures of myself up on Facebook. It's like, no one gave us the chance. But I remember us. I think we would have done that in a heartbeat if Facebook had been around. And so rather than, sitting around complaining about how young people have it better than us, which makes us look like old fogies, we decide instead that this is a threat to civilization and must be, must be addressed at once in the highest halls of power. That kind of, hypocrisy and lack of self-examination is always, alas, true of people my age and older. The second question, though, is much more interesting, which is when you grow up expecting to be able to find information at a moment's notice, what does it do to your ability to internalize information? And the brain is very, very plastic, very malleable, but at a certain point, it does get wired up, and it gets wired up in a particular way. And so I look at my son, who's 8, and he asked me, my wife, when Michael Jackson passed away, my wife muttered something at the breakfast table about him being a criminal. And my son later asked me, was that true? And I said, the dilemma of explaining the difference between accusation and proof and so forth, we're going along in this conversation, and I say essentially no one knows, right? There were these questions, nothing was ever proved. And he looked at me and said, not even Wikipedia? And I realized he'd never asked a question before, because he tends to be in the domain of facts. What's the fastest train, Dad? I have no idea, but Wikipedia does. What's the tallest building? I'll just look it up on Wikipedia. And suddenly he comes up to a question that's entirely interpretive. And clearly his worldview was a little bit shaken, because there'd never been a question he couldn't answer before. And so you wonder how much of his relationship to the factual is being shaped by the idea that you don't need to guess or estimate or remember. If you can get your hands on a keyboard, you can find out right then. So that's where I'm seeing it.
People found the idea of the novel simply horrific. People could not bear the idea of children sitting around reading. They should be, if they were going to read, it should be sermons and history, but certainly not novels. And they should be going about the place, sitting up straight and at dinner parties, and walking and being healthy. And then, of course, along came radio, and people couldn't bear the idea of people sit around the radio, and then television, and then games, and then computers, and all these things seemed to those who were not brought up in them somehow to diminish, because we're all so proud of our youth. We think our youth and our childhood was somehow, if not perfect, it was, even if it was imperfect, it made us suffer. How dare these children now not suffer the way I did? They should be having the kind of life I did, made to read, made to do this. They should not have this freedom, this access. Or if they do, while I can approve of it, I ought to suggest that it's dangerous, that it's going to go wrong. Well, yeah, I mean, some genies, when they're let out of a bottle, can cause problems, and they certainly can't ever go back in the bottle. When cars first arose, people were horrified at the deaths on the road. Horrified, they couldn't believe it. I mean, there were hundreds of people being squelched every day. It was grotesque. And if you just braked in a car at 30 miles an hour, you'd kill yourself on the steering wheel, you'd break your neck. People were dying all the time. Did they say, oh, that's it then? We can't have cars, sorry. In the same way as if someone says, actually, these mobile phones do give out microwaves, and they will give you brain cancer, are we going to say, oh, well, that's the end of that technology then? Not on your Nelly. There's a risk-reward ratio here, and for us, the reward is so great that whatever the risk is, we try and contain it and understand it at best. But what we don't do is say the risk is too great.
The web is like everybody lives in London. Right? The web is like everybody has access to this enormous pool of people, inexhaustibly large and diverse pool of people. And as a result, on Facebook, on Twitter, on MySpace, on Bebo, et cetera, people will have the experience of having thousands of friends. Right? Well, no one really has thousands of friends. It's either the word thousands or the word friends has to be struck out for that sentence to make any sense. So it's evident to everybody that the web has been this incredible amplifier of weak ties, right? We have many, many more connections. People we knew, from high school or from college that we haven't seen in years, but somehow we're linked to in this way. What we don't know is what that's doing to strong ties. And there has been early research to suggest, in a way kind of alarmingly, that there really is a trade-off. You can't just amplify the number of weak ties without decreasing either the number or the depth of strong ties you have. And if that's true, that's a big change, because it's nice to have people where you can say, oh, hey, I'm coming out to San Jose, you want to get together for coffee, whatever. But it's really nice to have somebody who'd loan you a kidney if you needed one. And if we're amping up the former at the expense of the latter, that's a really big change in the way human society works or can work.
Whether you meet up or not, you definitely get to know people over Twitter or electronic communication in general. With Twitter in particular, because it's a very lightweight to share something and to read something, then it's about sharing details that you wouldn't necessarily share, but that give you insight to people, whether you know them or not. It's not just meeting new people, it's staying in touch in a very lightweight way that just isn't practical. It's not practical to pick up the phone and call all of your friends that are across the country every day. But you can hear from them on Twitter every day, and it provides a real connection that you otherwise wouldn't have.
It keeps you much closer, so that it's not as awkward. If you haven't talked to a friend in a month, it doesn't matter. You can pick up the phone and you can immediately be like, so how, that run, it sounded like a good run you had the other day. You're immediately caught up on like the chit chat. You don't have to be like, so how's it? Are you still married, or is that a weird subject?
Yeah, I think you end up having more interesting conversations, because normally if you don't talk to someone very much, you only talk about the really big stuff. And like, well, I got a new job. How's that? That's okay. But it's like, it sounds like you're running now.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah, I think it's going to be pretty amazing to see how the next generation, I guess, evolves, if you want to call it that, because of their access to technology, but ultimately their access to information. I think education is being redefined. It's not necessarily about memorization. It's about finding, searching for answers. You have an infinite amount of resources available to you, or information available to you. And I think people, or this next generation, I guess they're much more knowledgeable about any topic that you can think of. That also, sometimes people think of I guess, the dangers of people trying to trick individuals with deceiving them with information that's not correct, that posting rumors. But again, I think this next generation is potentially more wary, or I guess conscious of that they are making their own decisions. They understand if they're reading a post or about to click on a link, where that's going to take them. So I think everyone's now is kind of conscious of how maybe people are trying to shape their thoughts or feelings. But again, that's not any different than what has happened in the past. I think different news organizations have different takes on just even one particular event, especially when you talk about the political system. So when you pick up a newspaper or turn on the television news program at the end of the day, they're trying to represent their point of view, which people would always have to kind of take with a grain of salt, I guess, if you will. But now people are, I guess, more conscious of that happening across the web.
Technologic, 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 technologic.